So I'm very pleased to greet Vanessa Place. She's an American writer and criminal defense appellate attorney. She has performed internationally, including at the Musée d'Orsay, the Getty Villa, and the Modern Museum of Art in New York, and published numerous books of poetry and prose. She's held teaching appointments at Université Paris-Nanterre, at the California Institute of the Arts, and the University of Colorado at Boulder. She's the author of Dies a Sentence, published in 2005, La Medusa, 2008, Tragodia Trilogy from 2010 to 2011, Boycott in 2013, and Last Words in 2015. So thank you, Vanessa, for being with us today and doing us the honor and pleasure. In this series, the first question is always the same. How did you become a poet or not a poet? And then we'll see how this develops.
Well, first, thank you for having me. I'm terribly excited. How I became a poet was the critic Marjorie Perloff asked me if I was a poet, and I said yes. That was, before then I was writing, I was doing different kinds of writing, but I didn't really categorize myself in a particular way. But when the question was put to me, all I could do was agree, and then that was that.
And what is it that you meant when you agreed then?
I think what I meant was that it made sense as a category because it didn't feel particularly confined, or at least the way I looked at poetry wasn't confined to lyric poetry or even not using prose or using appropriation. It seemed like a more expansive category to be in. I certainly didn't think I was a novelist or a fiction writer or, I don't know, an epic poet, but it was a big saggy bag that I could fit into.
And would you say that Marjorie Perloff's way of looking at poetry, and particularly at the time at conceptual poetry, was key to your decision in calling yourself a poet?
To become a poet. I think so. I mean, one of the things I've always admired about her as a critic is she's very willing to embrace the new and embrace new forms, and never has the reaction, categorical reaction of, oh, that's not poetry. She may look at a poem and say it's a bad poem, or what's the difference between this and a short story, but in terms of category, her embrace of language poetry very early on, her embrace of conceptual poetry did make it feel more of a place, so to speak, that I could be.
So the place you came from and still inhabit as a poet is the law. And I was wondering what the relationship, according to you, would be between your practice of poetry and your practice as a lawyer.
I think there's three things. I think on the one hand, the legal work informs the poetry quite a bit, where I draw from actual materials that I'm working with, like in Statement of Facts and Tragedia. I think the other aspect, which is a little more conceptual, is that there's a way in which I think of the law and poetry as being the same thing, where I'm sort of moving language around and sculpting language in a way to produce a certain effect on the hearer or the reader or something. So it's the same thing, it's just that in poetry the effect isn't quite functional. In the law it's always supposed to be terribly functional. You file a motion, you write a brief, you make an argument, and in poetry there's nothing to win. You don't win an argument, nobody walks free. You're affecting people's maybe perception of something, or maybe not at all. But it's not driven by the same functionality. And then I would say the third thing is that I kind of don't see a difference between them, where I think that they're both ways where language is used to make sense of something. Though what I like more about poetry in some ways is that the sense that it makes actually is not the sense that you walked in having. So in the law, you tell a story, and that makes people believe something, and they believe it, and then this becomes the law. In poetry, you encounter an audience with a set of beliefs, you present some sort of language, and maybe it undermines or it displaces what they walked in thinking, ideally.
We looked at some of your texts with my students, and we paid closer attention to texts that in some way addressed what we call major issues, such as racism or the death penalty, sexual discrimination and violence. Is there any specific reason that you could locate for you to be so interested in these topics?
Well, I think they're good topics.
They are good and they're necessary. But that's my opinion. I would like to hear yours.
And I think they're hot topics, so to speak. So they're topics that people have, again, usually their own very hard opinions about. And so I think that part of what interests me in exploring them through a literary lens is, again, this notion of, is there a way to show another, like a sculpture, to sort of walk around it and see it from a different angle? Since the idea is not at the end of the poem you think, oh, the death penalty is very bad, or the death penalty is excellent because these are horrible people. The idea is, like with Last Words, is, oh, there's some humanity in the worst of the worst, or there's some ambiguity that gets complicated, including in one's responses to a sex offense. So, but in terms of motifs, I don't know, maybe it's just because I thought if I was going to bother writing at all, I wanted to write about something that seemed more important than me, more important than whatever I feel when I see a bird fly or something like that.
When you mentioned Last Words, I would have liked you maybe to describe the work a little bit, because it's one astonishing book that doesn't have a word written in it, so that the text is to be found elsewhere. Could you tell us a little bit of how this came to be?
I found out, I think it was 2014 or 13, that the last words of all the inmates executed in Texas since 1981 had been transcribed and were on the Texas Department of Corrections website. And so I started reading them and realized what was interesting, a couple of things. One is I understood why all the other information about the person was there. I understood you want to know what their ethnicity is, so we know that it's not only people of color being killed. You want to know what they did, so you read a short thing of how horrible the crime was, so you know that it was a horrible offense. But what I couldn't understand why their last words were there. And then I thought, well, I think maybe I'm looking at it backwards. That the reason the last words are there is because most of them, they're legible. They make sense. They're not crazy. So the last words almost justify the execution. If this person can say something as banal as, oh, I love my family, or you've got the wrong guy, then they were presumably, there's some argument of, then they shouldn't have done this horrible thing, because they're just like us. So they made a bad choice. They made a horrific choice. So then it's okay to kill them. But then I also was thinking, but the words, there's not a recording of the words, a sound recording that's available to the public. But I also thought, well, I'm a lawyer. So what if I make a recording of all of these last words in my voice? So on the one hand, I'm acting as a mouthpiece, as a representative. But on the other hand, it also, or maybe by the same hand, it also is in this voice, which is much more of a voice of authority and a voice of some measure of education and all of that. So maybe they would be heard differently if they're not in the male voice or the Spanish-speaking voice or any of that. So I started doing an archival project of recording all of these last words in my voice, which I have to keep updating because they keep executing people. And one of the things I like about it is I've done it as a sound installation. And people listen for a while, and then they get kind of bored. And many of these statements are not inherently fascinating. And then it just becomes this drone of the voices of the dead. And also, as a side thing, one of the things that fascinated me about it was it seemed almost this pure Kantian moment of you know you're going to die in a matter of seconds or a minute. You're asked to speak. You're asked to basically transmit your subjectivity that will be recorded. So it's your final gesture of speech as having agency, as having subjectivity. What do you say? What do you say at that moment? Because most of us, we die, but we don't know it's going to happen 45 seconds from now. And mostly people aren't standing there writing it down. So that was also really interesting. And then I became really fascinated by the people who, given that opportunity, refused to speak.
You said that people would get bored. I remember experiencing listening to you, and after a while, what made me, I didn't go to the end, what made me quit was not that I was bored, but rather a kind of saturation with what to me was the pain that was being expressed, and also the fact that some of them took on a kind of almost poetic persona, in the sense that they also were authors of a text and aware that this text would be kept in ways that were radically different from their usual take on speech. So I was wondering whether that was relevant to you, or was it entirely a subjective reception?
Yeah, is it relevant? I think it's inherent in the work. And when I say people get bored, maybe it's, as you say, there's also a saturation that happens, where it's just too much. And the capacity for empathy or inquiry one hits a wall. But I keep thinking of when they do the the execution by lethal injection. The person is strapped basically in a crucifix form with their arms out. And there's this big microphone right in front of their face, which that image also was compelling to me and not to analogize between Jesus and executed murderers, but there was something like that of the last words. that are spoken. And I never identified in the piece what the person had done, because that was entirely irrelevant to the piece. It doesn't matter. And that's maybe the sort of pathos in it, that it really doesn't matter what they've done. What matters is right at that moment, what can they say? Or what do they want to say?
Maybe as a closing comment, could you tell us what you're working on at the moment, and what is it that you have found that's speaking to you and making you write?
A couple of things. One is I found a New York Times article on statements made about mass shooters, statements their neighbors made, their families made, and so I thought that could be actually a really interesting, again, poem to arrange them in a way where there's themes and it starts to become kind of elegiac. So that's one piece, that's an appropriation piece. And then I started working on something entirely different called a Memoir of America, where it's basically a memoir of myself and my family, but we've been in America since before the Revolutionary War. So trying to figure out how, and we've always been in the military, so trying to figure out how my family in some way mirrors or some part of the American psyche as a national phenomenon, which involves a lot of war.
Well, it's got research in it, and also to me, right when you mention it, it connects with what you did in La Medusa to some extent, and the way the mapping of LA and your city was, to me, also a mapping of the Angelina psyche, and the way the city was structured by its inhabitants and their perceptions, rather than its physical reality. So we were traveling through the city in ways that were not in direct connection with the physical map, but still did provide a map that was recognizable. So I was wondering whether the sort of geographical take would...
This is more historical in the sense of I'm looking at each chapter as a war that America's been in, the United States. The first one, it wasn't the United States. So, but also it's not historical in the sense of, oh, well, now I'm going to talk about this period of American history. There's a little bit of that, but it's also a kind of mapping of how did I end up becoming who and what I am with having this background, having this, how did America end up becoming who and what it is? So, to be honest, the first chapter, which is the American Revolution, obviously, it has a lot to do with Poitiers. because I was conceived in Poitiers, and my parents were married in Poitiers, met in Poitiers, and my grandfather was the military commander of the army base there. So that's where the revolution started, and of my birth, or of there's something about, yes, that where one starts in the genesis, but also there's about the law. It's a bit of a mess right now, but I'm sure it will make sense when it's done.
I'm sure it will. Thank you so much for those words. I'm sure it will make sense when it's done. Thank you.
Thank you.